Good afternoon and welcome to our live symposium from Faculdade Unida here in Brazil. My name is Graham McGeoch. I teach theology and religious studies at Unida here in Brazil, one of the professors. And I've been asked to host our conversation this afternoon, basically because I've got the best English on faculty, as you'll recognize. I'm from Scotland. But my guest today is a very special theologian from the United States. We are honored and delighted here at Faculdade Unida to welcome to our conversation, Dr. Eric Williams. Eric, hello, welcome.
Hello, Graham. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today.
It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to have a chance to speak with you this afternoon, to return some conversations we've had on other occasions and in other moments. So thank you so much for being able to join us. Of course, during this time of pandemic of COVID-19, it's a time of great restriction, but it's also a time of opportunity. And this is an opportunity for us here in Unida in Brazil. We are in Brazil. You are not. Maybe you just want to tell people where you're joining us from today.
I am joining today from Washington, D.C.
And how is things in Washington, D.C. today?
A lot of movement today. So people are coming out of the corners today.
Very good. Well, Eric, let me just give a very brief introduction to who you are for our guests. We'll have people from Brazil, obviously from the US, and indeed from other parts of the world, perhaps joining our symposium or conversation. So you are obviously from the US. You're from Illinois in the US. You've studied at the University of Illinois in Chicago, at McCormick Theological Seminary, which is a very well-known seminary in the US, at Duke University, which is also a well-known university in the US, and finally you did your PhD in Edinburgh in Scotland, where I'm from, which is just lovely. You're also an ordained minister of the Church of God in Christ, and you have a trajectory in the academy and the church, where you've taught in many theological seminaries and university settings. Currently, you are the curator of religion for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, based in Washington, D.C., and we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So, Eric, thank you so much for having the time. You're obviously a busy man. It's great that you can join us here for this conversation at Unida. Maybe I can just invite you, as we begin our conversation on Black theology, to tell us a little bit about who you are. Obviously, I've given the formal details, but there's a much more to Eric than his formal studies and theological studies. Who is Eric Williams? And tell us a little bit about your journey, both academic and in ministry.
Okay, again, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I had the privilege of visiting Unida in 2018, and it was my first time to Brazil, and I fell in love with the country and with the people, the culture, and I was very impressed with the work that you're doing at your seminary, and your mission and your vision. And so to be able to partner with you for this conversation is quite an honor for me. I was born in Rockford, Illinois, which is about 70 miles from Chicago. My father was a Pentecostal minister, Church of God in Christ. And in the words of Zora Neale Hurston, I was born with God in my house. The way in which our parents raised us, the kind of teachings around Christian thought and around particularly the teachings of holiness and Pentecostalism, which was undergirded, I believe, by a kind of a spirituality that was transmitted to my parents from their forebears in the South, which was derived from the kind of early kind of nascent forms of Christianity that was practiced by the Africans that were enslaved. My father was born in 1930, So his mother, his mother's mother would have experienced enslavement, and so there were kinds of things about our practices and our kind of spirituality that I think definitely derives from that kind of early African experience of African Christianity in the U.S. And so we were raised in church, spent a lot of time in church. We played instruments, did music and everything in the church. But as a youth, I was very interested in kind of spiritual things, I guess. I would expose myself to other to sermons from other denominations. I would read things. I was kind of unusual in that regard, because it was not just the attendance, but I also was very interested in the reflective life. In fact, I was looking the other day at my senior paper that I wrote the last year of high school, and I wrote my high school senior paper. We had to write on something in the United Kingdom, and so I wrote on the Pentecostal movement in the British Isles.
Oh, wow!
As a 12th grader in high school, I remember I would go to the library and I would look up and I would read books about religion, about African American religion, about slavery, and so I was very interested in those things, and it all kind of conspired together to bring me to this place where I am. I in undergraduate at the University of Illinois at Chicago, I met Dr. David Daniels, who was the professor of church history at McCormick, and he was my we attended the same church. So here is this Pentecostal church historian, trained at Union and Yale, teaching at the Presbyterian Seminary. And and as I began to kind of discern a call to ministry, I asked him what he thought about me going to some different places. And he told me, I think that you could get what you need at McCormick. And I went to McCormick, and that began my academic journey of faith-seeking understanding.
I want to pick your brains on that a little later about this Presbyterian influence on Pentecostalism, because this is a very relevant topic when we return and talk about Brazil specifically. But maybe I can just ask you a little bit. You said I was born with God in my house as a Pentecostal affirmation. In some senses, I was born with a Bible in my house because I come from a Scottish Presbyterian background. We both studied at Edinburgh under the shadow of John Knox, who was certainly interested in God and the Bible. What was it like as an African-American Pentecostal person studying at Edinburgh? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that experience? We're obviously both Edinburgh alumni, and that's a nice connection between us both. So what was your experience like moving from African-American Pentecostalism into austere Presbyterianism in Scotland?
Okay, no, that's a great question. But I would have to go back because to my years at McCormick, to get to Edinburgh, because what happened at McCormick, it was really interesting. This was a time when a lot of people were interested in Pentecostalism. Sociologists, because of the numbers, anthropologists. Then you had people like Moltmann, who had began these extensive dialogues with Pentecostalism, and so there was openness. And then, of course, my professor David Daniels was there. There was another guy there that was from an apostolic tradition who taught on the faculty at McCormick, and so I used those opportunities to begin to write and to read the kind of scholarly literature on Pentecostalism. After that, went to Duke to work with. He was trained in sociology and history of religions. His name was William Turner, and he was also a Pentecostal. And I read his works very early, and I was interested in his perspectives on religious, the kind of ways in which he he used phenomenological categories to talk about Pentecostal religious experience. I hadn't seen that before. And so I actually went to Duke to study with him. It was after that I met Alan Anderson, who was at the University of Birmingham. And I actually, before Edinburgh, I spent a few years at the University of Birmingham. Birmingham had a longer standing tradition of engagement with Pentecostal scholarship because of the work of a Swiss theologian by the name of Walter Hollensweger. Hollensweger had worked for the World Council of Churches. He taught in the School of Missions at the University of Edinburgh. But toward the end of his career, which was Selly Oak College back then,
Selly Oak.
Career, because he had also been raised in a Pentecostal tradition, that he began to write more about Pentecostalism. And he began to invite students from around the world who were working on these different forms of contextual Pentecostalism to come to Birmingham and study doctoral degrees with him. Many from South America and Latin America, many from the continent of Africa. And so after Hollensweger left, Alan Anderson came to Birmingham, and he continued in that tradition because he was also understood himself as a charismatic. And so it was there that I began to work with him, and things kind of fell apart with him. Sometimes things don't work, and it didn't work. And so it was Afe Adogame at the University of Edinburgh, who was working on African. He was also trained as a historian of religion, and he was interested in African immigrant kind of religion and Pentecostalism. And he thought, in conversation with him, he thought that Edinburgh would be a good place for me to finish, and so did I. And so I went to Edinburgh and got there. There were a number of people because he drew so many people, and the big focus on world Christianity. People were coming from all over the world to study at that world-class institution. And I feel very blessed and very fortunate to have had that opportunity to study there and to finish my degree with him. And subsequently, he ended up at Princeton Seminary. So he's here. That's right.
He's there with you now in the US. You're getting the benefit of his knowledge and his experience and his way of doing theology, which is also really interesting. But you had a very positive experience in the Center for World Christianity, which is a world-renowned center, of course, for studies. And Afe made a very important contribution along with his colleagues to the diversity within the streams of study. And that's wonderful. Oh, really good to hear. Yeah, really pleased to hear that. I wonder if I can just ask you a little bit about this angle of the religious. Already when you were in high school, you're researching perhaps not the most obvious topic for a teenager in high school. This religious outlook on life, which is very important to your formation and something you've pursued in your academic study. It's obviously very much part of your professional career at the moment in the Smithsonian Museum. Can you just tell us a bit about having this religious outlook, how you define that, how you work with that, how that strengthens you, how you bring that into the focus of your work?
Yeah, so I actually have always understood my spirituality as what undergirds my work, and it strengthens me to do the work. Like I said, I was born with God and literally inside of the house, and so these it was all the spirituality was always there. I grew up around a lot of older people who kind of had this idea, this kind of spirituality, that there was almost like a very thin layer between, and at any moment that they could be open to the transcendent at any moment, and that kind of spirituality kind of made me curious. And then, of course, in the Pentecostal church, we saw a lot of things in the church where people would have religious experiences within the within the context of worship. And all of that was, and I think that my initial interest in going to seminary was I wanted to kind of think about that stuff and try to make sense of it. And even some of my father's teachings that I experienced is very hard. But as I began to read deeper and deeper, and I began to find new conversation partners, new intellectual trajectories to engage, I became more and more fascinated by it. And of course, the opportunity to teach people who are preparing to go back into churches and other faith communities became something that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed. I never thought I would stop teaching, which I never will. But my primary vocation now is within the museum world, which is a fascinating world. And you're still asking questions about religion, but now you ask questions about kind of materialities of religion and what these objects mean and what they teach us about religion and how people understand the things that they have and they hold as being sacred.
Yeah, and one of the things about reconciling that is I noticed you'd given the 2008 is it Parnell lectures, you say at Fuller? Is it Parnell? I'm never quite sure where you put the emphasis in American English, where you gave a series of lectures on public theology but focused on the writings of James Baldwin. Is that right?
Yeah. So that was actually an event they had that was sponsored by the Parnell Center, and you pronounced it properly.
Oh, thank you. Apologies to all Americans there if I said it wrong, my Scottish American.
Yeah, so they had an event on public theology, and and I talked about these new dialogue partners that I would have, and these new scholars and thinkers, theorists that I would read. One of the writers that I engaged very early was the writings of James Baldwin, who was a literary a novelist and essayist, and whose work is very important within the study of cultural and literary criticism. Even in this moment right now, with the Black Lives Matter movement and these the George Floyd uprisings, Baldwin's critiques of the social order, they almost have a new life and a new currency. But one of the things about Baldwin is that in his youth, Baldwin was a Pentecostal minister. He had a profound conversion experience that kind of trajected him into a kind of Pentecostal world that he eventually disengages from. But all of his life, he continued to write about the religious experiences that he had, and some of the he also became a serious critic of the African American Pentecostal church. But I found his writings to be very, very provocative, very insightful, and because I was interested in religious experience, he uses very, very graphic, detailed language to talk about religious experiences that he witnessed and that he experienced within the tradition. So Baldwin became a pretty important source for me throughout my work, and I still use him now. And I hope someday that I can do a project on James Baldwin, because I think he'll like to teach us.
No, excellent. And that lecture series is available on YouTube for anyone who's interested in seeing how creatively you engage that religion and literature and Black stories, and it's just fantastic. So would you say to people who are watching, if they are interested in finding some of your creative ideas? In fact, I think you yourself describe yourself as the jazz man of theology. Can you tell us a little bit about where that phrase came from, what you mean with those kinds of things? Because it captures something that you don't often see in dull, dry academic conferences. So could you give us a bit of an insight into that self-description, if I can call it that? Yes, the jazz man of theology.
Yeah. So a jazz man in the world of ideas is how I phrase it. But I brought from Cornel West. He talks about his notion of jazz and how when one borrows from different traditions, and one borrows from different intellectual trajectories, that one actually is like improvising, like jazz, and that's how I kind of learned, and that's how I kind of teach. So you know, when I teach, when I write, I draw from literature, I draw from philosophy, I draw from history, I draw from art history, I draw any resources that I can marshal in the liberation of people. I draw, and so I see that as kind of being kind of improvisational notion, a way of just drawing what you need to help all that you can help, and to lift in ways that that give life and give meaning.
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned there just prior to this the Black Lives Matter movement that is in the US. That's a movement that people in Brazil are very aware of. Here in Brazil, they use the tag Vidas Negras Importam. And so many of the social movements in Brazil are also very engaged with that movement, Black Lives Matter. I wonder if you can talk us through a little bit about how you are involved or engaged with Black Lives Matter. And I ask this specifically because while many social movements in Brazil are very deeply engaged with Black Lives Matter, Vidas Negras Importam, many churches and many people associated with churches, and particularly Pentecostal churches, are using the refrain, all lives matter, as a riposte. And that's something that the Brazil and the US context are slightly different. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear from you as an African-American Pentecostal jazzman of ideas, to hear from you a little bit about Black Lives Matter, and particularly the religious elements of that.
Well, I would say first, you mentioned about the kind of tension and the lack of willingness to engage by some Pentecostal traditions there. The same thing happens here.
Okay.
Some African American churches are, and it's really the people, because sometimes a leader may not be interested in engaging in that way, but the people will. And you know, I have not been one, but this usually when there's a rally or a protest, I would try to go, but this time, and a lot happened right here in DC. I'm recovering from an injury, so I didn't get out in the street. But you know, in my work and in my writing and in my thinking,
sure,
and in my sharing, I think that there are many ways of being engaged and many ways of raising consciousness, and everyone won't be in the street. Some people will be preparing people to be in the street, and some others will. It will be through tweeting that they engage in their activism. It will be through art, through music, and so I think it's great for people to be engaged, and I think it's important. But I don't have a kind of litmus for or a standard for how we measure engagement. But Black Lives Matters, all lives matter, but Black Lives Matter. The problem is not all lives right now. George in the George Floyd uprisings is that this is happening too much. It's just way over the top is an expression we have here. The way in which Black bodies are being destroyed in the street, being destroyed doing in the yard, walking down the street, going home is just become very deadly for Black people. And so I think the Black Lives Matter movement and that mantra is just saying that we need to pay attention right now to what's happening to Black lives, and we need to resist these death-dealing kinds of ways in which police and state visit violence upon Black bodies.
No, thank you. And last semester, actually, here at Unida, I was hosting a course. We do a theology course in English from time to time, and one of the texts we read with students, I co-led the course with Mariana Thomas, a young Black theologian from Chicago. Curiously enough, Chicago must have all the good things. And we read Kelly Brown Douglas's Stand Your Ground, a part of her book, which really introduced to students here in Brazil the reality of Black Lives Matter and that whole movement that grows, and also theological reflection around that, which again in Brazil, that's not always perceived by people here in Brazil. So these have been really important. So thank you for your comments. One of the things, if I can explore with you a little bit, is we are here in a conversation, a live symposium by the Faculdade Unida on Black theology. I wonder if you can tell us, maybe in a very succinct form, what is Black theology for you? I ask this question because I want to explore in a minute with you a recent publication that you've edited where that doesn't appear in the title. It's a handbook of African-American theology, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I wonder if you can just tell us, Black theology is what we at Unida are talking about today, and you're publishing a book on African-American theology. For our Brazilian audience, particularly more than people who are perhaps in the US, can you just give us a bit of an idea of how you would delimit those, how they would interact, what your understanding of that would be?
Okay, so thank you. That's an excellent question. And one of the text to which you make reference is the T&T Clark Handbook of African American Theology, which was edited by Frederick Ware of Howard University, Dr. Antonia Damon, who's at McCormick Theological Seminary, and myself, which is a volume, quite thick volume, 33 essays.
32 pages, I see, in 4 sections. We'll talk about it in a minute. It's a fantastic book.
and so we what we attempt to do in the book is to look at the full gamut of kind of the theological kind of strivings of Black people in North America, in ways in which people have engaged, others have engaged with African American theology, which also encompasses Black theology, which is the what we understand as modern Black theology, which is this discourse that was initiated and instigated by James Cone in his Black Theology, Black Power text, which where it's almost like where African American theology takes an academic turn, and these questions that have been raised by Black people since the beginning of their sojourn in the United States, that it enters into the academy in a very forceful way, and people who have been trained in school within modern Black theology, they are in conversation with other traditions of academic theology and critique forms of colonial and oppressive kinds of theological proposals in the service of Black liberation and human flourishing. And so African American theology, then we look at both Christian forms of theology and the other non-Christian forms of theology, as well as those who do not understand themselves within the context of Black theology, modern Black theology, but also have theological projects that take seriously the lives, the experiences of Black people.
Absolutely. And just to highlight, the book is divided into 4 major, if you can say, thematic parts. You've got an area of, historical investigations, and then you look more in detail in part 2 at theological method and construction. By part 3, you're looking at very specific issues related to church, ministry, and leadership. And then in that 4th part, you draw into that wider experience that you're just alighting on there about, not necessarily part of the traditional mainstream Black theology, or indeed Christian Black theology, beginning to look for space for dialogues for African-American theology. How did that project come about? Can you tell us a little bit about it, how it came about? Because there's a tremendous array of leading Black scholars who contributed to that volume. It's something it's fantastic as an introductory volume to people who want to update themselves with current, debate, context, use of who are the leading scholars in the field. It serves so many functions. It's a beautiful book, if I can put it like that. It's a beautiful book. But just out of my own curiosity, here I am stuck in Brazil, having to import these strange texts from the US. How did that all come about?
So yeah, it was very interesting. I think Dr. Ware, Frederick Ware, who is a theologian at Howard University, he had been involved in, I don't know if it was a Cambridge companion to Black theology, but there are a number of projects that had been written that were like companion volumes that lifted up issues within within Black theology. And we kind of, were in conversation about areas that we thought that these works might have been strengthened. And we thought that we would try to produce a work that took on, methodological issues, that took on kind of history, but also that took on doctrine. And we invited not just academics to everyone was trained that wrote, but we had people who were working in other contexts like psychotherapy, trained as a theologian, but working in kind of counseling and pastoral care kinds of contexts. We had pastors that contributed. Also, they had the training, but the pastoral ministry, it raises different kinds of issues. And so we wanted we wanted the volume to be ecumenical. We wanted it to be international. We have some voices from beyond the U.S. We wanted to be, of course, contextual, and we wanted to also deal with, matters of faith and justice as well. So it, unfortunately, it's a very costly book, and we're waiting and checking every day, waiting for the paperbacks to come, because it's only in hardback form, which prevents it from really moving like we want it to move. But it's doing very well with the libraries and those who are fortunate enough to buy the text. But we're anticipating this fall that the text will be published in paperback, and it will become much more accessible to people like me.
No, perfect. And Eric, you're just sliding down my screen. Can you maybe just see your camera that we get? That's better. Great, thanks. As I said to you just before we came live online, we are in the process of acquiring a copy for our faculty library here in Brazil. One of the nice things about our librarian, Marisette Bishop, is she's a member of the Bloomsbury Publishing Strategic International Council. Okay. And so we're allowed to get a book at a discounted rate. So although so your book's top of our list and it's on its way, so it means that our students can get access to it, because it is a very, very expensive book.
Yes,
but it's a great book, and it's a real reference. I want to congratulate you and your colleagues on the initiative, on the wonderful variety of texts that you bring forth to show where scholarship's at, where the struggle's at, where the dynamics are for future direction for scholarship and study. It's a great introductory work for people like me who are outside of the context. And it reflected something. I've been in Brazil for 2 years here at Faculdade Unida, and often I say to Black students when we're talking about Black theology, that a Black theology in Brazil needs to be necessarily an interreligious theology, because if it's based on that Black experience that James Cone taught us all, the Black lived experience in Brazil is, the Muslim-led uprising in 1835 in Salvador. It's the Jewish population that was the majority of colonial Salvador who were Black. And our Black theologies that are exclusively Christian don't take into account fully the lived experience of the Black Brazilian. And so I was quite happy that I found some echoes of that in your book, not specifically about Brazil and not specifically about interreligious theology, but sometimes people looked at me and I said, this year in Brazil, I think you're a crazy man from Scotland. So it was quite nice to see, well, it wasn't so out of the box totally, but I think that's an area Brazil can learn from what you've produced, what others have produced in the US. So again, thank you very much for that. And I encourage people who are watching to look for the book T&T Clark, The Handbook of African American Theology, edited by Antonia Diamond, Eric Ware, and Eric Williams. It's well worth a look and a read. So thanks for that, Eric. I wonder if we can shift a little bit to Brazil. You mentioned right at the start that you have been in Brazil. You've certainly been here at Unida. It was wonderful to meet you when you came. As you know, in recent weeks, I was sharing with you that I teach systematic theology is one of the subjects I teach here. I think basically just because I'm the white European, for no other reason really, because my background isn't systematic theology, but I'm happy to do so. I enjoy teaching it. But one of the things that I do teach in systematic theology is African theology, right from the patristics onwards. We engage Black theology, James Cone and others, to show that there's more to this than just that white story of Reformation and Rome and all those kinds of things. And so I want to ask you some questions that are actually questions from my students who've had a chance to engage a little bit Black theology, particularly through the lens of James Cone. I know that that's not where Black theology is now, but these are just introductory things. Would you be happy if I was just to do some quick fire questions that are basically from my students? And I know some of them will be watching, and we can follow this up in class with them next week. But they're questions from undergraduate students in theology. So one of the things that the questions they ask is, one of my students asked, what's the relationship between Black theology and African theology?
So I'm thinking, that's a beautiful question. I'm thinking of an essay that was written by Charles Houston Long, who was a historian of religion. He recently passed on. But Long talks about what he calls, in fact, the article is called Structural Similarities in African and Black Theologies. And if your student reaches out to me, I'm happy to post the article. But Long talks about the ways in which, in terms of the way in which the kind of religious worldview, one key point that he talks about in which African and these Black theologies are different in outside of the continent is this idea of place. That African theologians they know the place as home. They know Africa as home with deep-seated traditions, time-honored traditions, deep kinship networks. But the African Americans and others outside of the continent, they find themselves, their primary context for doing theology is a strange land, and that Africa takes on within the Black diasporan imaginary, that it takes on a kind of religious meaning, and that Africa, and you see, and if you look at African American history, you see even like the African Methodist Episcopal Church. There was another church called the Ethiopian Overcoming Holiness Church. That Africa is seen as a spiritual possibility, and that becomes a source of theology. But it's always this quest for a home, a quest for land, and you see that concern taken up within Black theology.
No, thank you for that. And it's so fascinating for us in Latin America because we have the experience of the 20th century of dictatorships where Christians and theologians were exiled and that sense of loss and place and belonging, which has become diasporic studies in a broader sense. But there's a very specific Latin American angle to being forcibly removed from your land as a Christian, as a theologian, because you don't fit the regime. And that search for place and belonging. So that has deep echoes actually with the theology that we produce in Latin America, if I can say that. Another question that one of my students asked was that they had read some texts from James Cone. The student was themselves a Pentecostal, considers themselves a Pentecostal theologian, and noticed in Cone's text this emphasis on the personal testimony and experience, the music and the poetry, the way of praying, the use of the body in worship, and said, is Black theology just the same as our expressions of Pentecostal theology and revival movements? So in some sense, it's quite an innocent question, but I want to throw it at you and see what you make of that kind of question.
I think it's a great question. And one of the, we talk a lot about James Cone, but James Cone had a brother by the name of Cecil Cone. And Cecil Cone was quite a harsh critic of his brother's project. And Cecil wrote a book entitled The Identity Crisis in Black Theology. And in Cecil's book, he critiques his brother on the point of departure, where he argues that Black theology for James Cone, it begins with this idea of liberation. It begins with this idea of so Black power becomes a launching point for his theological project. But his brother Cecil begins his project. He argues that Black theology begins not with Black power or liberation from whites or anything like that, but he says it begins with the experience of the almighty sovereign God of Black religion. And so in the U.S. context, many Pentecostal theologians have beginning with a scholar by the name of Leonard Lovett, who they take that as their starting point, saying that how do we experience God but by the Spirit? So if the experience of God is the point of origination, then the kind of theological project looks different. So I would encourage that student to take a look at Cecil Cone's Identity Crisis.
Yeah, and thank you for raising that, because when we do Black theology in Brazil, one of the things that's really limited and difficult for us is access to the work. Most of the students at our university don't speak English. They have to read in Portuguese. And if you look at the theological or religious studies market of books in Brazil, you could count on your hand the number of Black scholars who are published. And so we are so limited with having access to resources in the Portuguese language. James Cone, some of his work, obviously, as the godfather of Black theology, is available. But then all these other scholars that have come subsequently, we don't have access to it, and it's really limiting. So this is why we get some of these kinds of questions. But thank you for pointing us in the right direction, and I hope that if there's any Brazilian editors watching this as well, that there'll be deep consideration about publication of Black scholarship, Black theology, Black religious studies. There's a gap in our market, in our understanding in the Portuguese language in Brazil, which again points to the structural racism that exists in Brazil. It's a huge challenge. Another question which came from a student was, what's the place and how does Black theology address reconciliation?
That's another wonderful question. There was probably the critic of James Cone's project that kind of journeyed with him the longest was a theologian by the name of J.D. Otis Roberts, who wrote a book. What was this book called? It was called I don't know if it was but reconciliation was in his theme. I can't remember the name of his text, but that was the kind of he thought that Cone's approach, Cone's notion of liberation was too hard. Mm-hmm. To use the scriptures, he would say that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto God's self, and that God had given to the church the ministry of reconciliation. And so he thought that reconciliation was the way forward. And so he launched a sustained critique of Cone in those terms. So reconciliation does become a theme within Robert's work, and then those who studied with him. Now, unlike Cone, Roberts did not advise doctoral students. So Cone has dozens and dozens of doctoral students, but Roberts didn't do that. He taught in seminaries and places that didn't have doctoral programs. But those who he inspired, they've taken that notion of reconciliation in Black theology and advanced that as a theological project.
No, absolutely. No, thank you for that. I want to bring you into Brazil a little bit, if I can, and hear a little bit about your impressions when you came to Brazil. Obviously, it was a very short visit, but I know through your church you also have links with churches here in Brazil, in different parts of Brazil. So you know a little bit about Brazil. It would be interesting for us here in Brazil just to hear some of your impressions, observations, a little bit from your perspective there in the US about Brazil, the church, our academic formation in theology.
Yes, so I had the privilege of coming to Brazil twice. And my first trip to Brazil, I just kind of traveled around the country. I came originally for a conference, but I guess he was my host or my guide or whoever. I was with Afe and Raimundo Barreto, mm-hmm. and they arranged for me to give talks in different places around the country. So I was in Minas Gerais, I was in, of course, Espírito Santo. I was in Rio de Janeiro. And I had a chance to kind of see, and I was down in Bahia. I had a chance to see the beauty of the place and the very dynamic kind of spiritual universe that the Brazilians of different traditions inhabit. I was actually in Bahia when they had the Festa de Iemanjá.
Okay.
My hotel was right there on the ocean, and the people had come from everywhere, and I was like, wow, I've without trying, I've happened upon a wonderful piece of research mm-hmm. just looking out my window. But one of the things that impressed me the most about my trip, being in my first trip to Brazil, was spending time with the students at Unida, and talking with them about their experience and learning more about your mission and the kind of work that you're doing and your commitment to recruiting and training women, mm-hmm. As well as people from the peripheries of Brazil, and the kind of diversity within your student body, and the I think it was 40%, I believe, of Afro-Brazilian, and 70% Pentecostal.
Yeah,
it was
you'll like that.
it was just amazing, and it's very interesting because in the U.S. context, places like McCormick Seminary, I think that they may have more, at one time I know they had maybe more Pentecostals than Presbyterians that were studying there. So I think it's it's really interesting to see how these Pentecostals now are becoming very interested in education. And because I know what education did for me, theological education did for me, I think it's good for anybody who wants to be in ministry and involved that way. And so I support it, and I want to support that.
Yeah. Well, it's great to hear you say. I mean, our president, Van der Leyen, head of the Hause, who you know as well, he has a phrase which says, here at Unida, we believe in education that transforms lives in a violent and violently unjust society. And that's really the core of our mission at Faculdade Unida, in education of quality, of depth, of training that transforms lives in a violently and violently unjust society. Because in our higher education institutes, particularly in public institutions, the majority of the students in Brazil are white, middle class. In their churches, the majority of people are poor and black. And in a course like Unida's, we reflect the reality of the church and not the public academic institutions. And we look to open doors. The majority of our students are, as you say, when you met them, Pentecostals, the 40% women, black, drawn from poor neighborhoods across Vitória. And for people who perhaps don't know the geography of Brazil, Vitória is a very small city. It's the capital of one of Brazil's states called the Espírito Santo. It's a small state, but it sits just north of Rio de Janeiro. It's about a 45-minute flight from Rio de Janeiro. But it's a small, some might say in the geopolitics of Brazil, quiet and irrelevant state. But it's a place where we've been able to pioneer education and reach in to the parts of Brazilian population that other parts of educational institutions don't reach, to give people a chance for that transformation. So it's really nice, Eric, that when you came here, you see that, because sometimes when we're at the coal face right in there, digging deep with people and struggling forward, we don't always have the time to hear that reflected back to us, that people who come and visit us see what we're doing, and to hear you say that you came and hear what you saw and think, well, that's actually what we're trying to do here. So that's really nice for, I think, us as a staff team and a student body to hear reflected. In a minute, what I want to do with those who are accompanying us live on YouTube or on Facebook is open for questions that can be addressed to Eric, so you can join in the conversation in a more active way. I've been taking Eric through some questions from the perspective of some of my students here, and also just a wider dialogue about his work and his publications. Eric, one of the things, though, that I want to turn to just before we open, or while we're collecting questions from others, is towards the end of this semester, perhaps at the end of September or the beginning of October, we're going to be partnering with you here at Unida to launch a course which we're calling Black Theology. I wonder if you want to give us a bit of a sense of what that course is about from your perspective, and why you wanted to partner with Unida in this initiative for later on this year, 2020.
I'm really excited about this this upcoming course, which is an extension course, which will be 100% online, to really kind of allow some of the different voices within the academic subfield Black theology to be to different voices to be heard in different perspectives. Two of the scholars that will be kind of part of the teaching team is Dr. Antonia Damon, who is McCormick Seminary, and Dr. Lisa Bowens, who is Princeton Theological School. Lisa is a Bible scholar, New Testament scholar, and she'll be talking about African Black hermeneutics. Antonia will be talking about womanist theology and womanist engagements of doctrine. So there'll be a kind of we're hoping to have one of the themes would be kind of Black theology among kind of decolonial and liberationist projects. Then one of the things, origins and developments, where you deal with some kind of foundational issues within the study of Black theology. Then womanist theology as a theme, Black biblical hermeneutics as a theme, and then to lift up some of the critical issues within the study of Black theology, like theodicy, like questions around race, questions around the atonement, that some theologians have had different kinds of angles on these issues, and just to kind of expose people to some of Cone's, some of his critics, as well as expose them to some of his students, some of his white critics, and some of his Black critics.
Absolutely.
And to kind of look at the ways in which discourse deepens and broadens and widens over time.
Yeah, and obviously you'll be participating. In fact, you'll be teaching part of the course as well, along with your US-based colleagues, which is great. And if you're from Brazil, we'll have João Chaves, who's a Black Brazilian theologian as well. So he'll be part of the course as well. And there's another couple of names that we're going to be confirming in the next few weeks. So it will be led by Black scholars in partnership between you and Unida at the second half of this semester. It's something we're really excited about in Brazil to move into a new area. It's so good to hear that we'll be going beyond James Cone or beyond Black theology. I have a very similar experience when I go back to Scotland now, because when I mention liberation theology, people talk to me about texts from the 1960s and 70s, and it's like, we've gone beyond that in Brazil, we've gone beyond that in Latin America with liberation theology. It's another whole field now. But people who are outside, sometimes if they're not able to accompany, they stay with the classics, which are hugely important. These are the foundational texts for us, but people dialogue with them in different ways. And I think the course that we're offering here in Black theology in partnership with you is really going to allow people to catapult themselves into the beyond and into the really interesting dynamics and issues that are currently being debated and researched. So we want to thank you for deciding to partner us. We are really excited about it, and so thankful for your input. I know you've been working closely with my colleague, Ken Arteja, who's one of the leading biblical scholars in Brazil as well, and you're putting together your heads to make sure that all fits together nicely, and we'll be presenting that for the wider public. And again, because you've said it's online, it's an extension course. It means that people can sign up and participate from anywhere in the world. The course is going to be available in English and in Portuguese. We're trying to facilitate access to education. That's again one of our key commitments here at Unida, is to facilitate access to education for those who might normally be excluded. And so this course in an online version, available to anyone anywhere in the world, and Unida will just be able to allow you to sign up and take part. So thank you, Eric, for that.
So I don't know if this is a good time. I had a question about that, but maybe
you can ask. I don't know if I can answer, but you can ask.
So I think it's very a wonderful thing that people don't have to be in Brazil to take the course. That technically a person in America who wants a course on Black theology might be able to very well take the course. And I'm just wondering if you could say something about what a course like this would cost if somebody wanted to take the course from America or from England or wherever.
Yeah, sure.
US dollars, please.
Yeah, I'll give you in US dollars. That's the language of the world. No, we at Unida, we are keen to give people the broadest access to education as possible. So for the course of Black theology later on this semester, it will be $25 US. That's $25 US is the cost to sign up, participate, have access to Brazilian and US-based world-leading scholars. We're able to do that in partnership with you for the cost of just $25. I say just because whoever's not in Brazil, that's a I don't think, a significant amount to invest in an educational opportunity. In Brazil, that's a significant amount of money, but it's also an accessible amount of money if people are wanting to have an almost unique educational opportunity of access to, as I've said, leading scholars in the field in this topic. So $25 to participate in the course, Black Theology.
So what I would say, I know that, sometimes money hinders people from being able to take the course.
Sure.
If you had 10 students, I'm happy to cover 10 students. Get you to get in touch with you that they want to take the course.
Well, Eric, you're
from Brazil.
Incredibly generous. Yeah, that's incredibly generous. We will make that information available in Portuguese, very clearly in Portuguese to people. That Eric here has very graciously offered to give a scholarship. Can I say it like that? A scholarship for up to 10 people from Brazil. The course will be fully paid, so it wouldn't cost anything in that sense. Eric has funded the scholarship. That's very generous, Eric. And I know that other people will come on board with scholarships, because some people, as you were saying earlier about the Black Lives Matter movement, not everybody's on the streets. People are participating in different ways. Not everybody will be able to participate online physically in the class. Perhaps some people will want to participate by offering to pay a scholarship fee for someone else to be able to have the opportunity to be in class, and that's totally possible. We would say to anyone who's watching, please just get in touch with Unida, and we can make that a possibility to ensure that people who don't have conditions to pay would receive a scholarship to be able to participate. If anybody wants to contribute financially, that's more than welcome. But it's $25, and I got now, with your very generous contribution, Eric, we say thank you very much to you for that generosity of spirit. You've been very generous through the whole process, giving of your time to be in the class, giving of your colleagues' time, and now giving from your very own pocket. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So I wonder if, I know we've got people following us in different parts of the world. I would like to broaden this conversation and draw in other voices, other questions on the broad theme of Black theology, or as Eric has said, on African-American theology, which is an even broader topic. Anything in just curiosity about Eric and his beautiful journey and trajectory, some of the work that he's engaged in. So let's open out for some questions, for some participation. As I said right at the start of our live, the reason that I'm here and the reason that I'm conducting the interview with Eric is simply because on the faculty staff here in Brazil, my English is perhaps the best, being the native English speaker, the only native English speaker. I hope my Scottish accent has been intelligible to Eric and intelligible to others as we've streamed live. But normally in Unida, it would be other people who would conduct these live discussions in Portuguese. Okay, we have a question that's come in here from Silvina Fernandes. Eric, I think you can see that on your screen. What is the name of Cecil's project, referring to Cecil Cone, James Cone's brother? And is there any articles that we can have access to?
Yes. So the name of the book is the Identity Crisis in Black Theology, and he has written a couple of shorter article length pieces. And if I don't see the name of the person who it was, but
Silvina.
But if
Silvina.
she will reach out to me, I can make sure I get that to her. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we can make that information available afterwards, Silvina. If you enter in contact with us, we can give you the full details of that. Thank you, Eric. Do we have some more questions for Eric that we can continue to prod his brain for him to share his knowledge and experience with us here? We're making the people in the background type very, very fast, Eric. I have another, while we wait for one more to appear on the screen, I have another question that a student asked me, which is, Black theology doesn't seem to address only religious questions. Why does it not only address religious questions? So Black theology doesn't seem to address only religious questions. Why does it not restrict itself to only religious questions?
I think that the for a person who kind of clearly operating from a Christian context, that all of life is seen as the subject of Christian theology. All of life is lived under the deity or under God. So what is not a religious question? How we treat people, how we share the things we have, how we use our resources, how we live in society. That those things are all considered to be under the God that made us as such, and so it has to be involved in the totality of life. I think that's the vision.
Absolutely. I wonder also if I can ask another question from one of my students, which is, it's a more practical question, because in Brazil, there isn't really, they do exist, but there isn't really a strong tradition of what you would call in the US the Black church. Okay. Churches wouldn't identify in general as being a Black church in the way that that's historically very important in the US for a whole series of reasons in the US context. So at a very practical level, how would, this comes from a student who's involved in leadership of their local congregation here in Victoria, and they were fascinated with Black theology, African theology, how to introduce that to a congregation which doesn't self-identify with the Black historical church, for example.
I think one of the ways I think is to, I think history is a wonderful way into kind of introducing new kind of topics and new subjects, that through delving into history and talking about why in the U.S. context there was a need for a Black church, and this idea of the Black church in the U.S. context being prophetic, in that it testified, its existence alone testifies and cries out against the sin in the white churches that excluded Black people from full participation. And so to talk about the historical factors that gave rise to that, and to now that there is a Black church in this whole matter of reconciliation, where you have you have churches that are that are led by Blacks, where whites participate. You have church whites where Blacks participate, and this whole multicultural church phenomena. But those churches ought to be challenged in terms of their concern for justice for all people, and for black people, and for the oppressed in their midst.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for this moment of conversation in its totality. Thank you for engaging my students. I'll be in class next week with them, and I'll be able to relay to them that we had this conversation, that you gave these answers, and see if they're satisfied with your answers. And I'll come back to you next week by email. And there's another question here coming from Inés Francisco. Can you see that on your screen there, Eric? Are there large non-Pentecostal groups in the African American church?
Definitely. The Baptists, Black are very large, and they have different denominations within the Baptist kind of faith, but they're together. They're larger than Pentecostalism. Then of course you have the Black Methodist groups, and then in our moment now, these Black non-denominational churches, which are growing, and these of them are what we call mega churches, and so Pentecostalism. When you look at the kind of Brazilian context, if you look at the U.S. From that context, you might look for the numbers in Pentecostalism, but there are other very large churches and denominations that are predominantly African American.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that with us from the US context. I think, Eric, we'll draw our conversation to a close. I know, as I said at the start, you're a busy man with so many different commitments and engagements and conversations that you're involved with as this jazz man of ideas. It's been a delight, a pleasure, an honor for us at Unida to engage you in conversation this afternoon in this symposium. I hope those that have been watching this being streamed on the YouTube channel of Faculdade Unida or on the Facebook page of Faculdade Unida have benefited and enjoyed the conversation. You can follow more information and more initiatives from Faculdade Unida on its webpage, Facebook page, YouTube channel, Twitter. All of that's available. And not to forget that in the second half of the semester, at the end of September, we are going to have a course on Black theology, again with the participation of Eric and colleagues from the US, colleagues here from Brazil, and not forgetting particularly for those here in Brazil that Eric has made a very generous offer of offering 10 scholarship places for that course for students from Brazil. The total cost, as people can participate from anywhere in the world, is $25 and you'll be able to get sign-up information through the various social media channels of Faculdade Unida in the coming weeks. Eric, a true pleasure. Great to be with you again. Thank you so much. I don't know if you've got any final words for our audience.
Yeah, well, I've enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to returning to Vitória when this pandemic is over. And
absolutely,
thank you. I hope that as many as possible can take the course, and that some of the people listening from the U.S. That they would be interested in taking the course, but also sponsoring those who cannot afford to take the course. I think that would just be fantastic. And if you are interested in doing that, you can contact the school directly, or you can contact me, and I will put you in touch with the school. But
perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And just to say that although this was a live transmission, it will be available afterwards, for download, for watching on the various social media channels of Faculdade Unida. And in a few weeks' time, I say maybe a month's time, we will have a subtitled version in Portuguese for those who would like to revisit or share it with a wider audience here in Brazil. I know, Eric, you're in good contact with many churches here in Brazil, and we want to give them a chance also to get access to the wonderful things you've been sharing with us. So we're committed to making a version of this somehow available in Portuguese so that other people in Brazil who don't always get access to the English language can have a sense of the wonderful work that you're engaged with. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And we do hope we'll see you live in the flesh in Vitória sometime soon. But we know we'll be seeing you very shortly for the start of our Black Theology course later this semester. Godspeed to you, Eric.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.